And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio here on the Big Talker, 106.7 FM every single Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern. We're delighted to have our next guest, obviously a Big Talker favorite, but someone that we have not yet had on our program. We're speaking with Andrew Donaldson. He's the managing editor of Ordinary Times magazine, ordinary-times.com. He is a veteran of several things, and he is the purveyor of the hashtag Twitter Supper Club. All around amazing follow, a great guy to have on the program. Very good insight into not only what's happening locally in North Carolina, but places like Virginia, around the country. He's a man of the world. So Andrew, thanks so much for coming on the program.
I'm thrilled to be with you. Thank you so much.
So yeah, let's just give a small intro for many of our listeners. I know that you are a familiar voice on the Big Talker. You speak with Joe a good amount, but I wanted to have you on here as well and hear your story. So tell us, Ordinary Times magazine, writing. You got a little bit of an accent that's familiar to North Carolinians, but maybe not to other people. So
Sure.
Tell us your story.
I've lost most of my accent, actually. I go home, it takes about 3 days for everybody to understand me again. But I'm actually originally from West Virginia, and then by way of active duty military service, I wound up living in Europe 2 different times and some other places. So my accent has changed a bit, but that's the accent. It's West Virginia. If I go home for 2 days and go to Walmart 2 or 3 times, we're back to hollers and hills and yonders and up yonder and then folks over yonder and that sort of thing. So that's the accent. I've been with Ordinary Times for about 3 years now. It's not mine. It's actually been around a long time. Ordinary Times has been around in its present form on the website about 12 years. And it goes back even further than that to the early blog discussion board type days of the internet. A lot of names, people that follow opinions would see in the alumni list of the website, even though it's very small. Folks that now work at New York Times, now write for Forbes. We've got people that have written for the Atlantic, places like this. So it's one of those smaller sites that really punches above their weights and has a wide variety of viewpoints, and we have great people, and I appreciate people checking it out. I got to writing about 3 years ago after I had a health situation where I wasn't working a quote unquote real job, even though I work about 16 hours a day, it seems like, doing this stuff. But and I started social media and writing as an outlet. And then Will Truman, who's the editor-in-chief of Ordinary Times, gave me an opportunity to, the immortal words of, hey, do you want to write something sometime? And that kind of ended up to me doing just a little bit of everything now. So I don't think he knew what he was getting into, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And it's been a blessing to have that outlet. And it's led to other things like being on the Big Talker and meeting people like you. And it's a great thing to be productive in the world, not just being a spectator of the world. It's a blessing.
Yeah, man, I hate to take you down because that was such a positive intro and a good way to do it. But something I wanted to highlight are some of your recent articles and takes. I don't think you hold back. I think that's something that a lot of the readers there definitely love, and I hope our listeners too. I guess there's something about a peach last couple of days here. I guess there's an impeachment that happened, a whole storming of the Capitol. You've given a little bit of commentary there on the website. You've had some great articles that we'll link to, but tell us what you think. I mean, we're only couple days. We're 2 weeks into January, and we're almost, we're almost just like this small speck of time, and that's so much insanity. Give us your take on kind of how it's been the last 2 weeks.
It's interesting because when it happened, about halfway through that, I had to get in the car and go somewhere with my 15-year-old daughter. So I was actually watching it with her, which was an interesting perspective to have and not just my own. And the last time we had been in the Capitol building itself, the rotunda, was actually for George H.W. Bush's lying in state. I took my 2 youngest children and we went to that. I thought it was one of those events that don't happen very often. The way politics go now, I don't think we'll ever have an event quite like that again, where you have a almost universally respected president like that. I was like, we need to go to this. So their last memories of the Capitol building is that event, this wonderful thing of community and the country coming together and people. And then I've got to sit there and talk to my 15-year-old daughter, where she's going, well, Dad, that's where you took us for the funeral. That's where they lay people that we're honoring. Why are they in there? Why are they doing this? And they're not super political. I keep my private life very separate from this stuff. So it was a very jarring moment. Then for me personally, it was just a lot of anger. And I don't mean internet reaction anger. I mean deep, righteous, seething love of my country type stuff that I would have to go back about 20 years to get something that made me that angry again. Uh, so it's been a process of working through it myself, and then also trying to put my writer filters on it of, okay, we need to be fair, we need to get the truth of things and those sorts of things. It's been difficult because I love my country. I wore the uniform for 12 years before I couldn't anymore. So there's a lot of emotions that go into those images, just like for a lot of people. And then I talk to my friends overseas, talk to friends that aren't Americans, and hearing their replies were just heartbreaking. And you're over there, so maybe you can touch on that a little bit more. But it's one of the few times in my adult life, I'm 40 years old now, that um, I really felt like I had to explain and defend my own country, and that's not a very comfortable place for me to be in at all, because I'm proud of my country.
Yeah, that's it. Definitely, just to give the small European perspective, it's a bit difficult because a most of these countries don't have impeachments. B,
Yes.
they don't really have division in government like we do in the states. Between the legislative, executive branches, and judicial. So that the sort of the sanctity of all of that, no one really understands that part.
No.
And I think what people do understand, obviously, is large crowds,
Yeah.
totalitarianism.
Yep.
Yep.
So they understand plenty of that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
on the Canadian side, what's funny is, so if you're reading Canadian media, I mean, it's very much just like, how is this even possible? How
Yes.
uh, obviously the conduct of the president and some of his associates in the lead up, but then logistically, like, how is that even remotely possible in the Capitol building of the most powerful country in the world? But on the polarization side and like the nature of politics, it's interesting because just this week, a liberal member of parliament, which is equivalent of a congressman, and a conservative member of parliament actually co-authored a op-ed in one of the national newspapers, basically saying, okay, well, we've seen now polarization kind of boil over not far from home, and we need to do whatever we can to keep things civil and to keep things above board so that we don't inherit these instances of hyperpolarization, which now we know can be very quickly mobilized into some pretty ugly and horrific outcomes. So I think from the Canadian side, people are looking at this and going, one, how did that happen? And two, okay, maybe let's tone the heat down when we talk to each other in Parliament or in the media, because we're all better off if we do that, and it's a lot easier to avoid some of these ugly outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah. And
don't become the U.S. is essentially the Canadian media nowadays.
Yeah.
well, it's interesting on our part, from the American side of it, is there's really been two schools of thought in it, and I think a lot of people shared this that watch the news of, this is utterly shocking and utterly predictable, and it's those two things at the same time that were very. It's a very unusual thing in a news event, where usually something comes out of the middle of nowhere or something that happens that you're prepared for, and this really was the mix of both. You have the initial revulsion of the imagery you see, and then as soon as you have about 5 minutes to think about it, and you start thinking about, like, oh yeah, this has been coming. Too many people, too much stoking, something like this. There was going to be a boiling point where the pressure cooker pops off and the steam comes out at some point. I don't think anybody imagined it was going to be that, but it's a very unique thing to our times, where how many news stories now over the last few years, those of us that do American politics and culture, um, how many news stories now do we say that same thing now? Like, this is really shocking and not surprising at all at the same time, over and over and over again. So to what David's saying, I think that's where the temperature comes down. Parts like when we start seeing stories that we react to, I think that needs to be the warning sign for us to kind of start, okay, time to stop and reevaluate. Because if we're saying that about a news story, if you say that about 4, 5, 6 news stories in a row, you're going to be in a really ugly, bad place in a big hurry that you don't want to be in.
Yeah, and you called it the high watermark of MAGA. So you definitely pulled some punches there. And I think for a lot of people who are able to do this full time, sort of being able to write and read and understand, we just have a very different perspective, in that we understand that there are nuances that go into certain things, things politicians will say or something that pops up on the news. Here, it was like really hard to try to
Yeah.
pick any nuance, right? It was just doors coming down, invasion of a space. It was really next level. I think you covered that very well in your writing in the article. That
I,
this was a long time coming.
I I'm careful with imagery when I go to places like that, but the high watermark thing, for you hate to explain something to it, but I feel like I need to because it's such a vast imagery. Um, in American history, the high watermark comment, and I actually ripped off Faulkner and just rebuilt it for the Capitol assault in the piece, and you can read it. I'll link it to my social media when this comes out. Uh, they talk about Gettysburg being the high water mark of the Confederacy. Pickett's charge was doomed to fail. They did it anyway, and that was the high water mark. That's the reference. And then there's the Faulkner quote from Strangers in the Dust, where he talks about, well, for every Southern boy, it's not noon yet, and I'm going to paraphrase it because my brain, I can't remember it all. It's not noon yet, and the flags haven't been unfurled yet, and we can still win, and we've got a chance. And it's really kind of been the bulwark of the lost cause for you know 2 generations now. My fear is that's kind of what that became. It became the people that completely had just lost their mind, like, oh yeah, we're gonna take this raised position of democracy with a few thousand people, and this is going to work. And it was destined to fail, and not only fail, but be a catastrophic failure and needless death. And now we have images of a police officer being beaten to death on the steps of the United States Capitol. So to use imagery like that, and I toned it down quite a bit from what it could have been probably. Um, I mean it to be that strong because that's where we're at. We have people now who legitimately, you just cannot deal with an abstract facts with them. They are just utterly convinced. And I don't have a good clean answer in a 30-second soundbite or in a thousand word piece on how to fix that. But that's where they were, and that's why I went to that imagery, because that's the kind of mentality you are dealing with here now.
And you've written about conspiracy theories as well, and sort of how they've propagated, and how they really just don't end up in a neat bow most of the time.
No.
How do you kind of see us going from here? Because there's plenty of theories being spun out there. I mean, I'm hearing
Yeah.
that there's going to be some huge operation by Trump at the inauguration. They're taking over satellites. They're going to announce a new government. I mean, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. The problem with conspiracy theories always is the good conspiracy takes a kernel of truth and then blows it up into the big thing. So when I'm watching the news right now, I'm watching folks that really, we saw it in Congress during the debate yesterday. They want to focus down on one little tidbit of this thing, like, oh well, when you supported an violence in the street, or when you did this, and they'll bear down on this one little thing, and then they're going to use that to blow that back up to excuse everything. That's how you start getting conspiracy stuff. Honestly, as far as President Trump goes, I don't think there's as much planning in what he does as people give it credit for. I think he's just a reactionary person for the most part, and then people try to go to things to explain his reactionaryism, and that's where you get more conspiracy. I don't. President Trump, with all due respect, he doesn't understand how our government works. He doesn't understand how the military works. He doesn't understand how, especially doesn't understand how the intelligence services work that would actually do stuff like that. But there's people attached to him and that can use his cause that do understand those things. So you got to be vigilant about it. But as usual, conspiracy theories fall to the same thing everything else does. You got to get to the truth, even if that makes you look bad, even if that hurts. If you cling to the truth, you're at least going to have a fighting chance against some of this stuff. So we need to pursue the truth first, and then let the rest of the stuff start falling where it falls.
Yeah, it's one of those things where for me it was always like, you know, that there has to be an intelligent person in the room with Trump to explain the ramifications of his actions, to say, hey, this is what may happen, or this is what could happen when you say these things. And so I don't know if he just internally rules with such an iron fist where dissent is not possible or alternative viewpoints are not possible, but it is incredibly depressing that no one apparently no one until now. After the fact, you have some people resigning, which some have argued is just kind of window dressing. No one was able to get through to him, and you weren't with us on the program when we talked about this, but Lana Del Rey, who may or may not be a astute political commentator.
She's top notch. She's hired. Next
Yeah,
radio show she's on.
yeah, but
She's
I mean,
better looking than with Hannity. Let's go with it.
yeah. So she basically said, like, I mean, there's a real possibility that Trump is just not aware of the consequences of his actions, and he doesn't have the self-awareness to comprehend like the linear path of from A to B. And I know you write about the cultural side of this, and so on that note, I'm curious as to what happens next. So I think some people on the Democratic side, or the more of the, let's say, never Trump or sane side of the Republican Party, as I would frame it, thought that maybe, okay, maybe this is the end. Maybe this is the end. But then as of yesterday, Congresswoman Green Taylor saying she's going to bring up articles impeachment of Biden on her first day or whenever she can, his first day in office. And it just seems like we've hopped on this train and we can't get off. And I don't know if you have any insight as to what could be next, or how does a two-party system function with such radicalization, comprising now a minority or a somewhat minority, I think, of your average Republican voter. But where do we go from here?
Yeah, two things there I want to hit on. The two-party system I'll come back to in just a second because that's part of it. The first part of this is culturally. Normally what happens in politics is when you have a change of presidency, there's a coalition of the people that are out of power who kind of take a minute, they reform, and then the new president becomes the new big bad, and they kind of put their own stuff aside because in opposition they can just all throw stones at the guy that's on top, and they kind of reconstitute and go on. And you see that when we went from President Bush to President Obama. All of a sudden, President Bush couldn't get on a Republican stage if he paid for it. Nobody wanted anything to do with him, but everybody just forgot most of that and moved on, and they were against President Obama. President Obama leaves office, President Trump comes in. Now the Republicans are in charge. So the Democrats, they kind of put aside a lot of their stuff and they all come out against Trump, and even more so because of the person and the nature of President Trump. I had thought, and I had written, and I've said this publicly, I had assumed that we would have something similar to that again. President Trump would leave office. The Republicans would recoalesce against, now we know it's President Biden, we didn't know then, and Kamala Harris is the vice president, and they're going to just recoalesce and attack the two of them. So that was the concern, and I thought they would do that. And that's a healthy thing, by the way. I'm not knocking it. That's how it should be. Okay, let's put away the old thing. Let's move to the new thing. My concern now, after the events of the last week, where you have 140 congressmen who, and I get they don't vote against the impeachment, but I'm talking more about their speeches, not the actual. And I listened to almost all of them yesterday. I'm not talking about just the vote against the impeachment. I can justify that. The speeches they gave, you're going to have this remnant, and I hate to say lost cause again because of the connotation, so understand how I'm meaning it. There's going to be this lost cause group for Trump that's just never going to convince he wasn't cheated and we weren't robbed, and they're going to cling to that. How big's that number? Is it, we used to call it the shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. Remember all that logic? Well, that's who we're down to now. We've got to shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. That's happened. They went down, Pennsylvania Avenue and attacked the Capitol. It's a little different, but that's where we're at. Is that 25%? Is that 30% of the Republican Party? Is that 35%? I'm afraid you're going to have that amount. And if that happens and there isn't a coalition against the Republican Party, you're going to have a split faction. The second part of what you're saying is the two-party system. You talked about Parliament earlier. Yaël talked about European systems. We have a two-party system. We have a two-party dominant system, but we don't have two strong parties. Those are two very different things. These parties are not strong. If these parties were strong, Donald Trump would have never become a nominee and the president, and Joe Biden would not be president right now. Remember, Joe Biden was dead in the water in the primaries, and the base, especially the African American base and the more centrist Democrats, rose up as one and kind of put down the more progressive left and put Biden in power. Our parties are not strong parties. They're very weak parties because they get co-opted and taken over. So to say that we have a two-party system, that's true, but our two-party system is not a strong one. And the one other thing I'd say about that is people always talk about a third party. Well, we already have two other political parties in America. We have independents, who is growing because the sides are, the extremes are shrinking, and it's pushing more people towards the middle. And then we have a fourth. Remember, even we had record turnout in this election. We still have a vast amount of people that do not vote or participate in politics in America. A shocking number. In 2016, if you took all the people that voted but did not vote for president, that group would have won the presidency and the electoral college both. It was that many people that did it. I've wrote about that before. So we really have four political parties, and they're all insanely weak and decentralized. How do you fix that? That's a generational problem. That's not something we're going to fix in 2, 3 years, 3 years. It's flaws too big of a term, but it's just an aspect of our system that our political parties right now are a lot more personality based than they are principle based, and that's just going to be the reality. And so my thought on that is, maybe we better pay a lot more attention to the character of the people we put in charge, contra what we just saw, because that's going to be the overriding factor, not the political party they're attached to.
You're listening to Consumer Choice Radio here on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. We're speaking with Andrew Donaldson, managing editor of Ordinary Times magazine. We hit all the negative stuff. I think we did the check marks. We did everything else. Let's turn to some more positive stuff. Definitely, that's something that you focus on a lot on your Twitter page, on any of your social media. You can follow Andrew, by the way, at 4 spelled out, and then the number 4, the fire. We'll link it as well. It's a lot easier. But yeah, tell us some positive stuff sort of that you've been focusing on or highlighting. Obviously, you're a man who's been around the world, and you understand a bit what's happening in other places, but then you're also picking up on other threads of, I guess, happy news that many of our people, certainly listening now, probably haven't heard.
Yeah, there's still good things going on in the world. I think one nice thing about we're seeing with the social media stuff, and we were talking about it off air, you really get to see people expanding their worlds with news and social media. Obviously, we're sitting in 3 different countries doing this right now, and it's going to air in a radio station that none of the 3 of us are even in. That's really cool stuff, man. I grew up in the 80s, man. In my family, if we had a family reunion, the youngest had to go outside to the antenna and turn the antenna to get the channel in just right. And somebody had to stand on the porch to relay the shouts of all the people in front of the TV. And I'm only 40 years old. That wasn't that long ago. We got 2 channels, 3 if it was storming. It's a cool time to be alive, man. Check it out. I can get online right now. We talk about this cultural stuff. If there's somebody of another race or another culture or another religion or whatever it will be that you're not exposed to because of where you live, hey, you can go on Twitter and talk to them right now, today. They're on there, and you can make friends with them, and you can do these sorts of things. That's a big positive. I think we get caught up in the news of the day a little bit, and we forget how good we have it lifestyle wise compared to most of the rest of the world and just about anybody in recorded human history. So I can do stupid things like go online and just talk about food all day, or I can write a 1,800 word piece on how I ripped my pants walking into a mobile MRI truck because I got an MRI in a tractor trailer. Think about that technology. Just stuff like that. I try hard in my writing. I fail a lot of the days, and I encourage other people, find the positive with it, because if it's just negative, 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 you wind up in a bad spot. And this is a really amazing. We aren't bored, are we, with the news of the day, as bad and bleak as it is? These are interesting times, and we can say we lived through them, and we have the technology to record what we did and how we reacted to them. I think that's a pretty positive thing.
Yeah, these are not ordinary times, are they?
Nice. See how you did that? See, everybody thinks it's a Catholic thing, and the story of it was really fun. I wasn't there when they did. They spent about a year trying to figure out what the name was, because the original listing was the League of Ordinary Gentlemen. And then when they brought it off the listings and they wanted to make it the website, obviously you needed to be a little more inclusive. So they're trying to figure out, well, now what do we call it? It was a play off the comics, of course. So that's how that happened. But ever since then, it's been dogged with, like, is that a Catholic thing, like Ordinary Time? Not that sort of thing. So it's pretty funny, but we're proud of it, and I hope people do check it out. It's going to be a lot of stuff you don't. I tell people all the time, I'm probably the editor that approves more stuff I disagree with than anybody. That's the way it should be. I want to be challenged in my thinking. So it's good people and good stuff, and I hope folks check it out.
That's
Just
fantastic.
a rare light, a rare beacon right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, especially given all the conversations in editorial rooms now. I mean, Yael and I chatted about this. It feels, I don't know how long ago it was because time is just a blur right now. But the New York Times and the pushing out of their opinion editor for publishing Tom Cotton, despite the
How
fact that
bad's that look now?
I mean, despite the fact that yes, Tom Cotton I find particularly objectionable, and I didn't really like his argument, but I mean, it's supposed to be the national newspaper of record. You shouldn't fire your editor because a sitting U.S. senator, and at the time, prospective Supreme Court nominee, wrote an op-ed. But on another positive note, I would love to hear your take as a son of the Mountain State.
Yes, I was hoping
I
you'd get to this.
Yeah, so I wrote, admittedly as an outsider. I have been to West Virginia. I've stayed in West Virginia. I like West Virginia, but very much as an outsider about what West Virginia had done right in regards
Yes.
to ensuring that those at risk, primarily people in care homes, were vaccinated. And I just love an insider's view as to what's worked, what hasn't, how did West Virginia of all states seem to figure it out?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I caught y'all's show last week, and you did a great job of it. I appreciate it very much. It's amazing because West Virginia's governor, Jim Justice, before the COVID thing had been, I'll be nice and call him an absentee governor. Uh, he was going to win re-election, but he literally, we could not get him into the capital city of Charleston to save our life for 3.5 years. And then all of a sudden, the vaccine comes, and this guy has turned into super efficiency. It's the most amazing thing you've ever seen. I don't to visualize for the viewers. Jim Justice is about 6'4", 6'5", and about 360, I think. He's not a small dude. So he very much lumbers when he does things, and he lumbers when he does policy as well often. But man, they've been killing it. Now there's a couple things here. I don't have the number in front of me, but West Virginia is one of the oldest populations of the 50 states. It's one of the highest, if not the highest, in what we would call, in European and Canadian terms, pensioners, to use the UK term. Folks that are retired, folks that are on disability, folks that are on government assistance as their primary means of income. I think we're always one of the top. My state is actually demographically bleeding to death. We're getting ready to lose one of our 3 congressional districts, actually the 3rd district, my home district. We will be losing that when they do realignment here in the spring. So it's very much an elderly state, an older state, and a declining population state. The perverse advantage to that, however, is that you have something that's really rare in America, where public health is actually the primary means of care for most of these people, which is unusual in the United States. So they hit the care homes quickly. They already have a database for a vast majority of the population because they're already on Social Security, or they're already on Medicare, Medicaid, or they're already on some kind of government assistance. So the communication barriers to get a hold of these people was a lot faster than a lot of people. One thing we don't talk about in medical stuff, and the reason we call our website Culture and Politics, my background is actually in logistics, and we always talk about the last mile in logistics. Amazon people, anybody orders Amazon, that's from the distro center to your house, the last mile. That's the hard part, because that's where all the variables are. Weather, somebody ain't home, the address ain't right, we can't find it, your house doesn't have the right street name on it, this sort of thing. That goes in politics, the last mile. How do you get it from theory and what I write on a website to somebody's head before they go vote? Medicine has a last mile, and that's what we're seeing with this vaccine. The last mile of it's being the problem. Well, the last mile in West Virginia was actually pretty easy because they already know all these people and they already know how to reach them. And there's a cultural aspect to it. If I lived in Germany 2 different times. I've been a patient in a German hospital. If I go on a street corner in Germany and ask anybody, where do I go to the doctor? Just the doctor, where do I get medical care? Almost all of them would be able to tell me because it's a nationalized health system. If I go to a street corner in Omaha and say, where can I go to the doctor? I may get somebody's primary care. I may get told an urgent care. I may get told an ER or whatever. And I'm not advocating for universal health care. It's just a cultural thing. The culture in West Virginia is a culture that was predisposed to public health. The government stepped up from being, frankly, I've been a big critic of the governor. He really stepped up his game and got this done, to his credit. So there's all those things that went into it, and for once we're number one in something, and it's really nice to see. In fact, I was just talking to my dad. My dad's 74. He got his notice on when his vaccine date was going to come on January the 4th. So he's known since January 4th what day he was going to go get vaccinated. And he's a
Incredible.
pensioner. Yeah, they're retired. My parents are both retired school teachers. He's on PEIA, that's the public insurance for West Virginia state employees, biggest insurer in the state. He got told on January 4th, you're getting your first dose vaccine on this date. He's known. In fact, I think it's tomorrow, if I remember correctly. So it's that sort of thing that the cultural aspect of medicine doesn't get talked about enough. But when you get down to the last mile of a vaccine deliver, it's everything. It's absolutely everything. Being able to reach these people, find these people. And I really appreciate people highlighting it. And I'm really glad our family's being taken care of back home.
And what role did partnering with local and regional pharmacies play in kind of capturing that cultural aspect that you mentioned? Because I mean, when I hear you say that, it sounds like a no-brainer to me. But then when I
Yeah.
heard Dr. Clay Marsh, who is, I think his title is the COVID czar, which I found
Yes.
perplexing, but he basically explained that they sidestepped warp speed. So warp speed was going to be two focal points, CVS and Walgreens. So to have a little bit more of a dynamic system in terms of points of receiving the vaccine, but West Virginia multiplied that by 200
Sure.
based on his estimates. And so what role did partnering with pharmacies play in ensuring that this was successful?
Well, here you go again. You're going to get a kick out of this as a consumer choice-based outfit. The West Virginia pharmacies have been in the news for the last couple of years, if you remember. West Virginia is ground zero for the opioid epidemic. It's an absolute friend of mine I grew up with is actually the district judge in a county where I grew up, and I was talking to him last time I was home, and just heartbreaking stuff what's going on with the opioid. We have a whole generation getting wiped out right now. The again, weird how things work out. All the pharmacies have been on the government's radar and the state government's radar for a couple of years now. So they already had all those inroads to talk to all the pharmacies. So, and believe me, those pharmacies were really, really, really looking for some good press. Because a lot of them, when you had one pharmacy in Oceana getting more orders of OxyContin than there was for people in the entire state of West Virginia, and that's a town of like 2,000 people, this sort of stuff. So there was already a relationship there, even though it had been a negative relationship. So now the state can go back to it and was like, hey, time to make good. Each state is different. I know in Florida, they're trying to get it into the pharmacies and they're having legal and medical regulation reasons why they can't get in it. They're trying to work around it. There's other places like that. So a lot of it's legalese and things like that. Part of the reason they were going around the warp speed stuff, and this, whether it's a school lunch or a student loan or anything, if you're doing business with the government, it comes with regulations and strings attached. Same thing with our stimulus money. So the warp speed stuff is great. And I think it's obviously worked. We got a vaccine in record time. There's also stuff in the fine details of that sometimes would hinder, because you can't just make a one size fits all. There's always a problem. So what happened in West Virginia was, to just nutshell it, these pharmacies have spent a couple of years in very close contact with the government for some bad reasons, but those contacts also turned into a avenue of communication where they could reach them all immediately, and you have a business sector in pharmacies that was really looking for some good press, and it worked because they're like, we can be the heroes now. We're going to save the day and get these vaccines out. And it all worked out. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So it's interesting to watch how recent history has played out in the state of West Virginia to make these good things happen out of stuff that frankly was very bad things only a year or two ago. And now we're seeing some good come out of them, thankfully.
Hey, Becky, why don't you pull up the opioid email list? Yeah, sure. All right, send it out.
There is. It's exactly what it was. The fraud units literally pulled out the pharmacy list and said, "Here we go. Like, here's all the pharmacies." And like, I'm not saying that people called them up and said, "You owe us," but let's all be real here. That's kind of how that conversation went with a lot of those folks, and it worked, and it's working, and hopefully it continues to work well, and other states can model it. But again, scale, guys. Talking about consumer choice here. Not all that's not going to work in California. That's not going to work in Florida or a high population state. You also have a very, West Virginia's, I have no idea what it is, 97% white Anglo-Christian. There's cultural things that go into that. The state of New York, the mess that is right now, that's not going to be scalable to everybody. So every state's going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with this thing. But for this one thing, it sure worked out really good.
And on that regulatory note, when you talk about the legalese, one thing when I was listening, so I was listening to a podcast where the West Virginia COVID czar was on it, and they asked, okay, well, what were the rules that you put in place for these pharmacies? Like, what did they have to have? And he goes, oh, it was really simple. They had to have super cold storage, and
Yep.
they had to have a backup generator in case the power went out so that the vaccines didn't spoil. And it was like very quickly for me, the light bulb went off, which is really what inspired me to write the op-ed that I did, because I was thinking, well, okay, so they've set a very clear standard of what is needed to facilitate this. Then multiply that by the cultural aspect you mentioned, multiply that by the fact that there are communication channels that already exist, and then bam, in 2 weeks, they managed to vaccinate the population who is arguably at the most risk, those who are elderly and living in spaces together. And so it'll be interesting to see what other states can learn from, even if it's, and the way I look at it, even if it's regional. So look at like an older population, pick a community like Naples, Florida.
Sure.
I would envision that something along this line of what West Virginia did could work in some of those population centers where you have a lot of elderly people, a lot of people who are either on government pensions or social assistance, et cetera. That we should be able to use those communication chains, which they could be for any other reason. I mean, it could. I don't know what other assistant programs look like, whether it's food stamps or other provisions that are provided to people, but we should be able to put our thinking caps on and say, okay, what other systems do we have here that we can piggyback off of to ensure that, one, people know when they're getting the vaccine and they get it quickly and it's done in a safe way. And so kudos to West Virginia for having the guts to look at this in a different way and say, okay, how do we best serve the residents of our state? And I mean, it's at the end of the day, if West Virginia can put their success can put a little pressure on other states or Canadian provinces to get their act together, that could be a huge plus for West Virginia. Maybe we'll know West Virginia for more than the opioid crisis and Country Roads Take Me Home.
One of those two things we're really good with being known for, by the way. We love country roads, and we've definitely adopted that. I actually wrote a whole piece about it myself, because trying to explain it to people. So yes, we know it's about Maryland. Don't even start. That song's ours now. Them's the rules.
We have it. We have it. Yeah. And speaking of guts, I have to have the guts to end our convo. It's radio. It's short form, but we had a great time, great conversation all over the map. We've been speaking with Andrew Donaldson, managing editor of Ordinary Times Magazine, ordinary-times.com. You can also find him on the Twitter, so we'll link to that. And check out the hashtag Twitter Supper Club that he runs. It's a great time. Andrew, thanks so much for coming on the program.
I greatly appreciate you, my friends. We'll do it anytime you want to. Very much appreciate you.
Beautiful. I think he's been branded a friend of the show.
Yay.